Donald Trump once said, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose any votes." For Trump, this was a brag about his devoted followers. But what if a presidential candidate had murders on his record? Not just a murder, but a list of crimes that would make even the most rabid supporters think twice. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. And in this episode, we'll take a look at the life of Andrew Jackson before the presidency. We have to take a look at Jackson and the controversies. Not only a slave owner and Indian killer and his questionable extra-constitutional uses of power, there's a lot to question about our seventh president before he even took office. What we're going to look at are the possible crimes committed by Jackson before coming to the presidency. Most American presidents, in all honesty, lives are pretty dry before they enter into the world of politics. Most come from at least an upper middle class background, if not straight up wealthy. They're educated at some of the best schools. 8 have attended Harvard, from John Adams to Barack Obama. 5 went to Yale. Every president since Ronald Reagan has had an Ivy League education. You have a few generals thrown in there, a couple honest-to-goodness war heroes. Some had success in business or as lawyers. There are a couple mildly interesting childhood or adolescent stories, but no other has a backstory quite like Andrew Jackson's. He was a child soldier, maybe committed 3 murders, not just hypothetical shootings in New York City, may have some light treason, a little bigamy, and an adoption that sounds a little more like kidnapping. But it all started with a childhood that comes straight out of a Charles Dickens novel. Jackson was born to Irish immigrants Andrew Sr. and Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson in Waxhaw, South Carolina on March 15th, 1767. In what at that time was British American colonies. It was not an easy start for young Andrew. His father died in a logging accident just 3 weeks before his birth, leaving his mother to raise Andrew and his 2 brothers on her own. While Elizabeth was known as a caring and devoted mother, it would have been brutal raising 3 boys as a single 20-something mother in South Carolina. While nearby extended family gave what help they could, things would still be tough for this family. It was clear from an early age that Andrew had some issues with anger. He once said, quote, "I was born for the storm and calm does not suit me," unquote. For the rest of his life, Andrew would find himself in the eye of that storm. When the Revolution came to the southern colonies, there were some truly gruesome battles and atrocities committed. The Jackson boys, not being ones to shy away from conflict, would find all 3 serving in the Continental Army. His eldest brother, Hugh, was the first to head off to war. Being of Irish descent, siding with the Americans against the British would have been natural, even if they were too young to understand the geopolitical causes of the war. When Hugh died at the Battle of Stone Ferry, the younger brothers ran off to enlist. Andrew was 13 years old at the time, and Robert, his remaining brother, maybe 15. Andrew and Robert would see actions oftentimes with Americans who had sided with the British, Tories. In fact, it would be a Tory, neighbor of one of his family members, who would lead to his capture by the British. Andrew and Robert found themselves on the run from a British patrol when they took refuge at the home of some relatives, the Crawfords. A Tory neighbor informed on them to the British, leading to Andrew and Robert becoming prisoners of war. Andrew at this time was 14. So a 14-year-old POW held by the British. And if you know anything about prison conditions during the American Revolution, this was an absolutely horrid, abysmal existence. In the prison camp, Andrew and Robert were witness to the inhumane treatment of 18th century POWs. A lack of food and disease were the common and major factors impacting prisoners. In addition, it seemed that the British officers tried to single Andrew out, likely because of his age. One officer demanded Andrew polish his boots, but Andrew refused. He stated he was a prisoner of war and a soldier and demanded to be treated as one. When the enraged officer tried to strike Andrew with a sword, fortunately, Andrew threw up his arm in a defensive stance, and the blade struck him on the arm and hand with the tip cutting his forehead. He was left with these scars from the sword, but worse was to come. In the camp, he and his brother contracted smallpox. It was at this same time that his mother had learned where her sons were being held. Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson was no timid, quiet 18th century woman. She had raised 3 boys on her own on the frontier and had already lost one. She was going to do whatever it took to get the other 2 back. She traveled to the fort and worked to get the boys released as part of a prisoner exchange. Once back home in Waxhaw, she began to nurse the boys back to health. However, Robert was too far along and he died shortly after returning home. Weeks passed until Andrew was well enough to get along. It was at this time that his mother learned that her nephews were also being held by the British. She decided to attempt to duplicate her efforts that she had done with her sons and headed off to win the release of her nephews. This would be the last time Andrew would see his mother. She would contract cholera and died. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and the only thing Andrew got later were her clothes returned to him. Now at 15, Andrew found himself an orphan and had lost his entire immediate family. Andrew would shuffle from family to family for the next few years, and this would not always run smoothly. While staying with a family that ran a boarding house, Andrew got into an argument with one of the boarders. While Jackson could not remember the exact cause of the argument, he did recall later threatening to, quote, "assuredly send him to the other world," unquote. This ended with him being sent off to live with another family. But as luck would have it, Andrew was about to come into a little money, most likely from the sale of his mother's property. He was off to Charleston, where he discovered a love of the nicer things in life. With a little money in his pocket, Andrew decided to embrace some of the more cultured parts of society. While Andrew had grown up rough on the frontier, his mother had instilled in him a love of learning and the classics. Turns out he was quite the lover of Shakespeare. So it was not overwhelmingly difficult for Andrew to pass himself off as a gentleman. He also took classes, not just in law, as he would go on to become a lawyer, but also in things like dancing. Dancing was an important part of 18th century high society with balls and cotillions going on. But even with the law license granted in 1787, the rough edges were not quite polished off. Jackson even would challenge his first opposing counsel to a duel. A cocky, fiery 20-year-old lawyer who, in places objecting, is like, "I want to fight about it. And this means to the death." The duel was called off, but this would not be Jackson's last challenge. He then moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, where he'd build himself a reputation, not just as a bright young attorney, but, as it was said, quote, "he was the most roaring, rollicking, game-cocking, card-playing, mischievous fellow that ever lived in Salisbury," unquote. He was the type of man who men wanted to hang out with, but their wives did not want them bringing him home. His most famous mischievous act, while in Salisbury, came at the annual Christmas ball that Andrew had somehow worked himself into being on the committee to run this ball. He thought it would be a good idea to invite 2 local prostitutes to the fancy society event. This caused the event to come to a screeching halt. The 2 women had to be escorted from the event, reportedly laughing as they were removed. As for Andrew, he had to apologize, saying he never believed the prostitutes would actually show up. Now, I always imagine this scene with the wealthy gentleman trying to act as if they have no idea who these women are. Their wives super pissed off, and Andrew sitting by the side watching the chaos and probably laughing to himself. Now, at this point, you need to understand Andrew would have been about 21 or 22 years old. So, though a becoming respected lawyer, he still has a little bit of that young hellcat in him. 1 year later, Andrew found himself again in a volatile argument. This time, he found himself at odds with an Avery Waystill. A challenge was given and accepted in a duel set. However, both men, feeling honor had been served, fired their pistols in the air. Firing your pistol in the air during a duel was a signal that you were surrendering. It was the honorable way to step away from shooting. Now, some claim that Andrew had fought in hundreds of duels, but in reality, while challenging and being challenged to many, it seems that only two actually came down to people really shooting at each other. And it might have been the most happy event in his life that would lead to his duels becoming deadly. While traveling, he met Rachel Donaldson. Rachel's late father had been a member of the House of Burgess, and the family was well known and respected. Mrs. Donaldson, Rachel's mother, had opened her home to boarders, and in 1788, shortly after his 21st birthday, Andrew came to stay in the Donaldson home. It was there that he met and immediately fell in love with Rachel. She was young, beautiful, smart, cultured, and married. At 17, she had married Lewis Roberts, 10 years older than her. From the start, people described the marriage as unhappy. Robards was drunk and abusive, and Andrew, young, charming, sophisticated, fun, and handsome. It seems she also took an immediate liking to Andrew. She was, however, very married, even if at this time she was living with her mother. Robards brought his wife home to Nashville, but quickly began to show jealousy due to Andrew's attention. After an argument where Robards caused both Rachel and her mother to break out into tears, Jackson came to her defense. An argument between the two ended in threats of violence. Robards then left Rachel and went to Kentucky. But he soon said he was going to return and fetch his wife, actually saying something to the effect that he was going to haunt her every move. Rachel made the decision to leave town and head to Mississippi, and Jackson chose to escort her. Here's where things become a little fuzzy. When word came that Robards had divorced Rachel, she and Andrew quickly married in 1791. As it turns out, Robards had filed for divorce but would not be granted until 1793. So legally, Rachel was married to both Andrew and Robards for 2 years. According to Jackson, everything was sorted out by 1794 and the two were legally remarried. Yet rumor has it that Rachel and Andrew had actually been living together as man and wife as early as 1790, a year before Robards had ever filed for divorce. Now, you think this would be a huge scandal, and this would end any chance for the now 20-something Andrew to pursue a political career. But in the 1790s frontier, people seemed to have a much more relaxed view of these things. It also turned out that Rachel's family preferred Andrew over Robards, and so at least in the short time, this seems to have worked out. But it would give cannon fodder to later arguments towards Jackson. In fact, it would lead to this little quib during his campaign of 1828 against John Quincy Adams. Oh, Andy, how many men have you hung in your life? How many weddings make a wife? Now, this would, of course, absolutely enrage Andrew Jackson. It was during this time that Jackson started to make his fortune. Between slave trading, buying and selling confiscated Native American land, Jackson was able to set himself up as a gentleman farmer with his first plantation that he purchased in 1796, before later acquiring Hermitage, his famous plantation that you can visit to this day. Like the vast majority of Southern planters, Jackson used slave labor, at one point owning as many as 150 slaves. Also, like many of the planter class, Jackson found himself oftentimes cash poor, but land rich. Now, despite the questions about the legality of his marriage and his sometimes non-existent funds, Jackson was able to serve on the Tennessee Constitutional Convention in 1796. Then later that same year was elected to the House of Representatives. And finally, Tennessee would select him to serve in the U.S. Senate 1 year later. Jackson, however, would resign his Senate seat after only 7 months. It was then that Jackson was appointed to the Tennessee Superior Court. Jackson would resign this position when he was elected commanding general of the Tennessee militia in 1802, beating out John Sevier, the man who had actually appointed Jackson to his judgeship. In the autumn of 1803, Jackson came into conflict with the former governor of Tennessee, John Sevier, and the argument seemed to focus around the service each had rendered to their state and country. The attacks became very personal, with Jackson implying that Sevier was a fraud, when Jackson spoke not only of his service in the Revolution, but also in brief skirmishes against Indians and his elected positions. The governor replied, quote, "I know of no great service you have rendered the country, except taking a trip to Natchez with another man's wife." Jackson at this point goes full on Will Smith at the Oscars, and in a keep your name out of her effing mouth moment, the argument turns violent and a shootout in the street actually starts. Luckily, one man was only grazed and no one was seriously hurt. Remember, though, this was the former governor of Tennessee and a Superior Court justice that were in a gunfight. Politics today can be heated, but I don't think we're going to see Justice Roberts and Governor Newsom gunslinging anytime soon. 2 years later, Jackson gets caught up in the Aaron Burr scandal. Not the whole shooting Alexander Hamilton part, but the later craziness. While it seems he had no idea of Burr's treasonous actions, he did agree to build and outfit 5 boats for Burr's expedition. What Burr was up to, if you're not familiar, was a plan to take over some place in the American frontier and set up his own country, maybe even launch an attack on New Orleans and seize the city. Now, while Jackson doesn't seem to have been privy to all these plans, he does begin to suspect something is going on, and so he sends a letter to President Jefferson and to Governor C.C. Claiborne of Louisiana, telling Claiborne, quote, "I think there is something rotten in the state of Denmark," unquote. A callback to the love of Shakespeare his mother had installed in him. Burr would later go on to be arrested, but acquitted of treason. As for Jackson, his whole career in the affair seems to have been little more than giving lodging and boats and supplies to the former vice president. In 1806, in Logan, Kentucky, Jackson would again find himself in a duel over the honor of Rachel. Jackson got in a heated argument with Charles Dickinson over a horse race. Jackson loved his horse races and loved gambling. Now, exactly what was going on here? Was it a question of someone getting stiffed on a bet? Was it a question of which horse really won? I do not know. But in the course of yelling, Dickinson will make what becomes fatal mistake by making a rude comment about Rachel and questioning the status of their early marriage. This prompted Jackson to challenge Dickinson to a duel. While most thought the duel would never take place and that Dickinson would leave town before the shooting started, Jackson said, quote, "It would be in vain, for I'll follow him over land and sea," unquote. So on May 30th at 7 a.m., Jackson and Dickinson met at the Red River in Logan, Kentucky. Dickinson was a known marksman, and he fired the first shot, hitting Andrew in the upper chest. The bullet would remain there for the rest of Jackson's life. Now bleeding, Jackson was able to raise his pistol, take careful aim, and killed Dickinson. The law in Kentucky was on Jackson's side, and the killing was considered legal, but that would not stop people from accusing Andrew of murder. This would not slow down Jackson's career, though. He kept gaining a reputation as a frontier leader and a member of the militia. He had served as a judge and a general in the militia. As Indian troubles built up in the Southeast, Jackson was commissioned as a general in the U.S. Army. I'm not going to go into his legendary service in the War of 1812 or the Creek Wars, even though his actions in the defense of New Orleans bring up some legal and constitutional questions. It was his actions after the war in Florida that really raised the questions. The Seminoles had caused great issue by basically ignoring the border between the United States and Spanish-held Florida. Of course, to the Seminoles, this border was absolutely meaningless, as no one had ever bothered to ask them if they wanted to live in Spanish Florida or the United States, Georgia, and they probably really didn't recognize these borders in the first place. In December 1818, Secretary of War John Calhoun sent Jackson to deal with the Seminoles with, quote, full power to conduct the war as he may think best, unquote. To Jackson, the best way to deal with the Seminoles was to invade Florida without the express permission of the U.S. government. Now, typically, we don't just allow the military to invade other countries' territories unless they are actually given permission by the president or possibly a vote of Congress, but Jackson didn't really seem to care about these pesky legalities. When Calhoun found out about this, he was pissed by Jackson's overstepping of his mandates and wanted to see Jackson censored. Congress had discussed the issue, causing Jackson to threaten to cut the ears off of one congressman. The congressman reportedly responded that he had seen Jackson on many occasions after the threat, and if you notice, he still had his ears. Personally, I wouldn't poke the bear here. After all, Jackson seems a little nuts. It would ironically be John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, who would come to Jackson's defense. The irony being, of course, that Adams and Jackson would become the most avid political opponents of the day, and Calhoun would end up serving as Jackson's VP. As in fact, Calhoun served as VP for both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Adams supported Jackson's move in Florida because it would force Spain to cede Florida to the United States. In short, Jackson straight up stole Florida, and the Secretary of State was like, well, as long as we don't have to give it back. What really caused questions, other than the unapproved invasion of foreign territory, was what Jackson did to two English citizens he found in Florida. Robert Amberson and Alexander Arbuthnot were most likely just trading with Native Americans and Spanish in Florida. However, Jackson's deep-seated hatred of the British was apparent. He had not only fought 2 wars against the British, but he had lost both his brothers and his mother at the hands of the British. Andrew would accuse these 2 men of being British agents who were stirring up trouble with Indians. Jackson had the 2 men arrested. Then, acting as judge and jury, he tried the 2, found them guilty. He then had the 2 men executed, starting an international incident. Whether this meets the bar of a war crime can be debated, but it clearly looks very cold-blooded. This was not the first questionable move of Jackson's during wartime. In 1813, during the Creek Wars, Jackson adopted, and I'm using air quotes here, a young Creek boy. Now, this case of adoption is kind of a relative term. Jackson and Rachel had no biological children, but they had adopted Rachel's nephew, Andrew Jackson Jr. And nieces and nephews were commonly roaming around Hermitage, but how Lincoya came to be a Jackson is a different story. Jackson's forces had attacked a Creek village, slaughtering the population. One of Jackson's men had reported he had found a surviving Creek boy. Jackson, maybe reminded of his own orphaning, chose to take the boy home as a, quote, playmate, unquote, for Andrew Jr. While some might see this as a heartwarming story in the middle of the evils of war, some also might call it kidnapping. How loving was Lincoya's childhood in the Jackson home is unknown. He lived at Hermitage until his death in 1828, the same year that Rachel would pass away. Lincoya died in July of tuberculosis, and Rachel in December from a heart attack. While many point to the personal attacks against Rachel during the campaign of 1828 helping cause her death, it could also be possible that the loss of Lincoya played a part in Rachel's failing health. I've often wondered that if Lincoya had lived to move into the White House with Jackson, would it have impacted Jackson's thought on Indian removal? Maybe not, but having his Creek son there, while he decided to allow the removal of natives from their ancestral homelands on a forced march to Oklahoma, might have given Jackson a moment of pause. In any case, we will never know. Jackson served 2 terms as president, and while we can look back at his actions at key points in his presidency and question his motives and even vilify him for some of his actions, he would be viewed in his time in office as a president of the common man. His actions in the nullification crisis with South Carolina, the war on the Bank of the United States, and his straight refusal to carry out the decisions of the Supreme Court, famously stating, "John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it," which led to the Trail of Tears, all made Jackson look like a powerful leader who cared about the common people. When his financial policies led to the Panic of 1837, and then the people saw the horrors of the Trail of Tears, Jackson had left office, and blame would fall squarely on Martin Van Buren, a man who had only become president because he, like Jackson, had sided with Peggy Eaton in the Petticoat scandal. If you don't know anything about the Petticoat scandal, it is a wild situation involving Peggy Eaton and suicide of a former love interest and marrying the Secretary of War, and causes the entire Jackson cabinet to fracture. It is an interesting story, and Peggy Eaton, a very interesting lady. So was Jackson a murderer, kidnapper, bigamist, and war criminal? Well, maybe. While in the world of modern politics, nothing seems to be surprising, you really have to question if a man like Jackson could be elected today. Not only was he a man of fierce loyalty, with a temper and a willingness to use violence at the slightest provocation, one could simply claim that Jackson was a product of his time, and while this might explain some things like owning a plantation and slaves, the gunfights, the threat of cutting off ears, the summary execution of not only supposed spies, but his own soldiers, if you look into his wartime record, and rumors are true. Maybe this can be explained by the violence Jackson would have witnessed as a 13-year-old soldier and POW. Maybe the anger of having his entire family killed by the time he was 15 left serious emotional scars. Whatever it might have been that pushed Andrew Jackson, it left a fascinating true story of a larger-than-life figure who would leave a lasting mark on the history of the United States. And of course, leave us with the question of whether or not to put him on the $20 bill. Irony alert here. Jackson hated the idea of the national bank, or what we call a Federal Reserve today, and thought it would be best if state-run banks and private banks issued currency. In short, we honor the man who killed the first national bank and opposed U.S. government-issued currency by putting his face on the $20 bill. That's just one more reason to maybe put Harriet's face on there. So how you view Jackson is something you'll have to decide for yourself. Was he a murderer, kidnapper, war criminal? That's up for you to figure out. I'd like to thank my sources: John Meacham's American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, and Kenneth C. Davis, Don't Know Much About History, Everything You Need to Know About American History But Never Learn. Programming update. Starting this month, I'll be dropping episodes every other Wednesday instead of on the 1st and 15th. And Spotify listeners, don't forget the poll. Just scroll down to find it. And until next time, this has been Mick Biddick, and History is Criminal.